everyone. Welcome to Math for Anti-Racism Season 2 with Teachers to Teachers Global. We are really glad that you are joining in with us this evening. So our Executive Director, Allie, wasn't able to be here. She sends her apologies and I am stepping in. My name is Callie Herring. I am the Director of Global Partnerships for our organization. And as we get started tonight, I'm just going to provide a little bit of information about the reason why we're here. So, if you joined us in the first season of Math for Anti-Racism or in the first episode of the second season, we've been exploring together the role that anti-racism plays in the math classroom and also how quality math education contributes to a more just society and how anti-racism is a part of that. So as we are going deeper into this second season, we are really going to be exploring the concepts of quality math education and its connection to more just societies through a lens of anti-racism. And so that's really going to be our focus today, is digging into this, the intersection of math, anti-racism, and social justice together. So at this point, I am going to pass it on to our co-founder, Chad McGlone, to introduce tonight's guest speaker.
Thanks, Callie. Yes, I'm excited to be here. And we're with Dr. Kyndall Brown. So it's great to see you, Kyndall. And most importantly, it's not in his bio yet, but he is on the board of the Education Advisory Board for Teachers to Teachers Global. So I'm so excited about him working in that way. So Dr. Kyndall Brown is a former middle school teacher and a high school math teacher who has worked for 35 years improving professional development in math for mathematics teachers. He's the executive director of the California Mathematics Project, which is a statewide network of professional development organizations. So thanks for being here, Kyndall.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yes. Kyndall also went to Nepal with us. We spent 2 weeks together riding rickety buses and taking plane rides through the mountains there, looking beside us and seeing a peak of a mountain higher than the plane. Never forget that. So, all right, let's get started. So the first question we have is what is the intersection of social justice, anti-racism, and mathematics?
So, in 2017, I helped co-author a position statement on social justice for the Benjamin Banneker Association. And in the position statement, we looked at social justice from 3 different aspects. We talked about social justice, and that's planning a lesson to look at serious or even provocative issues using mathematics. And so in 2005, with the publishing of Rethinking Mathematics by Rico Gutstein and Bob Peterson, it really provided for many math educators the first time where we actually had resources and lessons to implement into the classroom. And since then, organizations like Creating Balance in an Unjust World, that puts on the Social Justice in Math Conference, created their website, radicalmath.org. And in last year, NCTM published a book with high school lessons to explore, understand, and respond to social injustice. And so that's one aspect, right? So it's actually doing lessons. The second aspect is with social justice, and that's focusing on the demeanor of classroom interactions. And so it's thinking about, what does your classroom environment look like? How are students able to interact with one another? Are all students able to engage in mathematics regardless of their race, gender, sexual orientation, language, nationality, immigration status, right? And then the third aspect is for social justice, and that's using mathematics as a tool to be used to challenge the status quo. So it's really getting students to use mathematics to explore their world. Rochelle Gutierrez talks about mathematics it should be a mirror and a lens. We should be able to see ourselves in the curriculum, and it also should be a window for us to be able to view our world, right? And so when I think about where anti-racism kind of intersects with that, I think about more of the second aspect, the with social justice, focusing on the demeanor of classroom interactions, because we have to acknowledge that, you know, the way that mathematics education has been organized has been pretty exclusionary. I mean, I was an undergraduate math major. You know, I studied math through high school and college, and I never learned anything about the contributions of people of African descent to the field of mathematics, right? We always learn about, it's very easy to believe that it's only, you know, European men who made any contributions to mathematics. And so there's a dearth of information in the curriculum. And then when you look at, you know, how mathematics plays itself out, you know, we've been for years talking about the so-called achievement gap in mathematics and how, you know, some students based on race and ethnicity don't perform well in mathematics and those students who do. But then when you start to look at the structures of, you know, schooling, you'll find that oftentimes if a school is predominantly African-American, Latinx, they're less likely to have the most qualified mathematics teachers, right? Or even in schools that, you know, are high achieving schools, the higher you get into the mathematics curriculum, the fewer students of color and girls that you see, right? So, you know, if we're talking about, you know, anti-racism in mathematics and where racism plays itself out, I think it's in that aspect of the way that, you know, mathematics enacts itself in schools and in the larger society. And then when you even take it to the advanced level, who's getting degrees in mathematics, and particularly who's getting PhDs in mathematics, right? So I think that's where anti-racism really plays itself out.
I see that. Can you expand a bit on, I mean, I sense that there's a real responsibility then for the teacher to know her or his students for this to be effective. Because if I haven't taken a chance to know who my students are and what their backgrounds and our history is or culture, that could inhibit my ability to meet their needs.
Well, that's at the heart of culturally relevant pedagogy, right? It's knowing who your students are, it's building positive relationships with your students. And, you know, in more recent years, you've been seeing a lot of work around really tapping into community funds of knowledge and how do we bring that into the classroom. And in 2016, Todos Mathematics for All and NCSM put out this joint position statement on social justice and mathematics. And one of the action items that's called for in that statement is partnering with families and communities as resources for mathematics education. And so that's really where you're getting to know your students and your families and figuring out the ways in which they use mathematics on a regular basis, and figuring out how then to make those connections into the classroom, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'm thinking about that connection with, you know, math with, about, and for social justice, and that's something that our team has really been exploring as well. And one of the things that we're hoping to connect to Math for Anti-Racism throughout this year is math with, for, and about anti-racism, and really digging into, you know, at the beginning, this for. And so thinking about how, you know, also, you know, not only is it important to practice anti-racism in the math classroom, but that the critical thinking skills that students build through quality math education can also support anti-racist societies, and being able to examine additional perspectives and, you know, challenge your own thinking. You know, our tagline is challenge your thinking and change the system, for this, you know, this series of live chats. So that's something that is really interesting to hear you talk about. And I'd like to build on that with our next question, which is really thinking about the why, or this with math for social justice. You know, what does it mean to communicate that? How do you communicate why that matters, why math for social justice is important, and how it connects to the classroom?
So, I mean, first and foremost, the reality is too many students in general aren't being successful in mathematics, and too many students of color in particular aren't being successful in mathematics. And so we have to critique the current system that is producing these outcomes and start to really think, then what are we going to do differently that's going to have a positive impact on those many, many, many people who've been unsuccessful with math and really have a phobia around mathematics, right? So, I think that's where it starts. And then, you have to then begin to start evaluating. People really have to start being reflective and looking at what is about their teaching practices that might be the cause, and what are the resources that we're giving communities that is going to support their mathematical development. I mean, I think one of the things that has been exposed very clearly in this pandemic are the disparities between different schools and communities and who has access to the technology that they need in order to be successful, right? And that's just been made glaringly clear that, under-resourced communities are the ones that are suffering the most, right?
Yeah, and thinking about also what you said with funds of knowledge and recognizing, the math that already exists so richly in our students' lives and in their families' lives. And that was something that came up in our last conversation, in our episode 1, when we were exploring the generational impact of quality math education. And we had a 4 generations of a family, or 3 generations discussing and talking about, for the 4th generation, what are things that could be done to support, a young child who's about to turn 2 to develop as having a strong math identity as well, and seeing math as something that's only of a benefit to himself and to his people and to his community.
Yeah. Kendall, what does it look like? What is it? So if I walk into a classroom and you go, okay, this is one that's really pushing anti-racism, whereas I see this as an anti-racist classroom, and this is what social justice is valued here. What does that classroom look like? Is it a teacher in the front, overhead projector, textbooks open?
No, I would expect to see students working together in collaborative groups, engaged in inquiry and exploration, asking questions, collecting data, analyzing data, and interpreting the results of that analysis, right? I would see student work visible on the wall. I would see images of mathematical scientists on the wall that are reflective of the students who are in the classroom. I would see the use of technology, right? I would see students engaged in discourse and challenging each other's ideas in respectful ways, right? I'd be seeing, I don't know, those are just some of the things that just come off the top of my head. As students posing questions and, all of those kinds of things that we talk about in the standards for mathematical practice, right?
Right. Well, so what's the nuance? Because I can write a good mathematical task so that may not honor the culture and or the the social justice. So do those look different if I'm pushing this?
Well, I think that is where, what we discussed earlier, the importance of a teacher really knowing their students well. So knowing what are the issues and concerns that students are dealing with that they can then bring into the mathematics classroom. It's also about, the ways of interacting, because not every, we have to be realistic that not every mathematical concept can necessarily be taught through a social justice lens, right? But it's taking every possible, by knowing your students well, by knowing, the issues that they're dealing with and their concerns and their interests, the more likely then you are to be able to make those kinds of connections for students, right? And again, even if the topic of every lesson isn't necessarily one that is what we would consider social justice, what are you doing to make the content accessible to all students, interactive, in ways that they can engage one another, right? So.
Yeah, sort of valuing to each individual student's contribution to the class as part of this whole, regardless of who they are. Seems like, yeah.
Yes.
I have one more question, Callie, but do you have a question? Yeah. I may have lost her for a second. Let me have one more quick question, because you also mentioned resources. And I think that's such an interesting thing for me to think about, because some schools just have more resources. I mean, there's more wealth in the community. So how does that balance happen? Because, I'm thinking about a group in Malawi I was working with that didn't have electricity. And so some of those kids were just, their school was closed, period. Those who had electricity, probably more privileged, were able to continue learning. How do you balance that? Because if you can learn, you probably should have school.
Well, I mean, I think that, schools, communities are going to have to really organize to advocate for resources, so that resources are evenly distributed in ways that don't lead to these kinds of disparities. Schools get a lot of resources and oftentimes don't allocate them in ways that are for the benefit for the best benefit of the students. So it's really important. That's where, this whole, what I mentioned earlier from the Totals Joint Position Statement, including families and communities as resources, I think is, if a school is really, focused on anti-racism and social justice, then they have an obligation to really include parents in meaningful ways, not just to come and do supervision or to supervise the parent center, but really educating them about the instruction and curriculum and what their students need in order to be successful, whether they plan on going into the workforce after they finish school or whether they plan on continuing their education. They need to know the role that mathematics plays in that process, what their students need to know and where they should be at what particular point in their educational trajectory, and how they can support them, right? How they can support them at home, how they can support them at school. But I think it's really going to take that kind of community awareness and organizing to advocate and push for equal distribution of resources. Other than that, I really don't see how that change is going to happen. Right?
Yeah, I think,
and parents need to connect to social movements that are doing that kind of work as well, because it's hard for them to do it alone.
Right. I love the idea of the community development as well. I mean, one, because it continues this kind of learning idea at home. And some of the communities we work in, the kids who are in our classrooms are learning to speak for themselves, to have a voice, to challenge logic. And then that happens at home. If the parents aren't behind it, they don't understand what's coming. That could be. So the entire community enrolled as part of this is key. That creates the social change that we look for.
Right, and I think that also, gets at the whole issue of culture as well. What are the cultural norms of a community and what is acceptable? Because, in the math class, according to the standards for mathematical practice, we want students to construct viable arguments and critique each other's reasoning. And Robert Berry talks about this a lot. What if that's in conflict with your culture, that you don't critique the reasoning of somebody who's in a position of authority, right? How do you how are you sensitive to that so you're getting students to engage in the mathematics in the ways that you want them to, but that isn't at odds with their cultural belief systems and practices, right?
Yes, yes, okay. And I really want to follow up, but to stay focused on that, that's such an interesting point. Let me ask the last question we have. Why might practicing anti-racism be necessary to achieve social justice?
Because if we don't really dismantle the systemic barriers that are put in place that stop, students of color from succeeding, then we're just going to continue to perpetuate the same systems, right? So I think about San Francisco Unified School District that took the very bold stance of detracking. And I mean, they really did it, right? They stopped teaching algebra in 8th grade. So everyone in the middle school gets the same curriculum. There's not some special group of students who start getting algebra in 6th grade, right? Everyone starts algebra in the 9th grade, and you really don't start to be able to accelerate until I think after, everyone's had geometry, right? That's taking a very bold stance, a very strong anti-racist stance, because so often we know in most school districts, in the school district where my daughter goes to school, that's only reserved, only a small group of students are going to be able to make it all the way through that pipeline, right? So those are the kinds of really bold moves and believe you me, I know I have colleagues that work in the San Francisco Unified School District. They are getting a lot of pushback from affluent parents who want their children to be the only ones who make it to AP Calculus, so they have a better chance of getting into UC Berkeley or UCLA, right? So it takes real courage to do something like that, but it also takes that community support in order to sustain it, right?
So, and I've heard this question as well when I propose this idea. So what about the parent who says, well, my child could be in Calculus 15 by the time they go to college, so why are you holding them back? So the very gifted kids, when they're in an untracked classroom, how does their math improve still? Or are we holding them back?
Right. And so that is, again, that's where the teaching comes in. So Joe Bowler talks a lot about low floor, high ceiling tasks, right? Where all students are able to enter the task and engage, but some students, those students who might be at a higher level, can take the task to a higher level, but all students are going to be able to get the learning the required learning that comes out of the task. So it's being able, here again, knowing your students, being able to manage those differences and knowing your content well enough too, so that you can choose a task that's going to cover that range. But your goal should be raising the student who's at the lowest level up to the level of that higher student. And so that comes with the pedagogy, with the teaching moves, and how you have students share their responses, and using strategies like complex instruction, where the goal is to raise the status of low status students, right? So it's the pedagogy and the mentality of the teacher and how they enact their curriculum that's going to be able to meet the needs of all students, right?
Right, yes.
I'm really hearing a lot about the overlap between what research is continuing to show is quality math teaching and anti-racist teaching and teaching for social justice, that those things are not separate, that when we are putting into practice what research is showing to be quality math education in our classrooms, then, and with intention, incorporating anti-racism and social justice, we're not asking for two completely different things, but that those really line up really well with one another, so that all students are able to thrive, both individually in class, but also collectively as a group.
Yeah, I really think it's the mentality of the teacher, right? The teacher has to really be deliberate about you know, and have a definite intent to make this kind of thing happen, right? And um, I don't know that everyone is there, right? I know people may have good, may want to do that, but just don't necessarily know how. Um, but then, you know, there are some people who are just determined. I mean, you know, began my teaching career in, you know, inner city Los Angeles in the mid 80s at the height of the drug gang
Mhm.
um, conflict in Los Angeles. And, you know, oftentimes many of my students were in the criminal justice system, had been incarcerated, and this school was the first school that they were coming back to. And those students were as bright and capable as any other student, right? They just needed somebody who was going to believe in them and allow them to engage in the mathematics in the way that's going to help them grow. And if you read Francis Sue's book, The Mathematics of Human Flourishing, I was really surprised when I read that book that at the end of every chapter, it's a dialogue between the author, Francis Sue, who's a math professor, and this young African-American man who's incarcerated, but who discovered mathematics while he was incarcerated and just has this brilliant mathematical mind. But why wasn't somebody able to recognize that when he was a third or fourth grader, right? Why did he have to end up in the prison industrial system before he was able to, you know, discover his mathematical talents? And how many students are out there with that same ability that is not being cultivated, right?
Wow.
Yeah, we're talking about the highest quality of education for all students, no matter what.
Absolutely.
I was at a workshop where someone was talking about teaching for social justice, and every example was this sort of student-centered task, or that fits the best practices that we talk about in mathematics. And the question I had was, can you do this if I have a textbook that says, here's an example, watch me do that example, now practice that example? And the person said, I just don't think you can. That's that's a traditional European strategy that teaching.
And I would agree. I think if to really get at a social justice task, it has to be a more open-ended kind of task, right?
Mhm.
And it's interesting, I think that there are kind of a certain degree, there's a continuum in the new NCTM book. They kind of go along this continuum of a really good standards-based task, and then, a task that deals with a real world situation, and then a
Mhm.
task that actually has a social justice context, right? And
Mhm.
so, we want students, I guess we're trying to get them to that last phase, but then we're also dealing with students who, um, haven't had that kind of instruction. Maybe all they've had is the kind of teacher-centered instruction that you were describing, Chad, up through high school, and then all of a sudden they come into my Algebra 1
Mhm.
class, and I'm saying, no, we're going to do these open-ended tasks, and right, they're like, wait a minute, you have to they have to unlearn
Mhm.
what they
Right.
think math is, right? They think
Yes.
math is doing an exercise to get the right answer.
Mhm.
And there is only one way to do it the way the teacher did it, and there is only one right answer, as
Yes.
opposed. And so, it's really kind of reintroducing them to what we think math can be and should be. So,
Yes. Oh, Kendall, this is a fun conversation. I'd love to go right off of that right now and talk about that too. But that will have to be phase part two after this commercial break, which will be a long commercial break. Callie, you want to close for us and to wrap us up?
Sure. So yeah, in closing, thank you so much, Kyndall, for being here with us, for sharing your knowledge and your thoughts with us. Thank you to our audience for joining in. We also want to invite all of you, particularly those of you who are educators of any level, to join our online community of practice and participate. We're going to drop the link into the comments here. And in this participate community, you can sign up to be a part of a course that goes along with this season of Math for Anti-Racism. And so in this course, you will be able to engage in discussions about these episodes as we learn together. You'll be able to access resources recommended by each of our guest speakers. And so we invite teachers to come in and participate with us in the platform. So the link will be there. And then right now, if you go in, you'll be able to find all of the content in the course from our season 2, episode 1 a few weeks ago. And in the upcoming days, we will update it with the content from this episode. So thank you so much, everyone. We look forward to seeing you soon and interacting with you and participate. And Kyndall, thanks again.
You're welcome. Thank you.